The Mojave Desert stretched endlessly in all directions as Marcus Razor Kane pulled his Harley up to the weathered cabin he hadn't seen in 2 decades. His father was dead, and this godforsaken place was all he'd left behind. Beside him, his German shepherd Rex whined nervously, hackles raised at something only he could sense. Marcus had spent 20 years as a Hell's Angels enforcer, collecting debts and burying problems in the desert sand. He thought he'd seen everything evil had to offer. He was wrong. The moment they stepped inside, Rex went berserk, clawing at the basement door, whimpering like he'd caught the scent of death itself. The floorboards beneath Marcus's boots felt wrong, hollow in places they shouldn't be. His father had always been a loner, but the neighbors' whispered stories about missing hikers suddenly felt less like desert legends. As Marcus gripped the basement door handle, his blood ran cold. What if his father hadn't just been a hermit? What if he'd been something far worse? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rusted handle turned with a grinding screech that echoed through the dusty cabin. Marcus had ridden through 3 states to get here, following the lawyer's cryptic phone call about his inheritance. "Your father left specific instructions," the man had said. "You're to handle his affairs personally, no one else." Now, standing in the oppressive silence of the desert hideaway, Marcus understood why the old man had been so particular. The cabin reeked of secrets, layers of them, accumulated like dust over decades of isolation. Rex's frantic scratching at the basement door intensified, his claws leaving fresh gouges in the already scarred wood. The dog's behavior sent ice through Marcus's veins. In their 5 years together, Rex had never acted like this. The animal had been his partner through countless runs, had faced down rival gang members and federal agents without flinching. Whatever lay beneath this cabin was something else entirely. Marcus pulled out his phone, cursing when he saw no signal bars. Of course, his father had chosen this location for its remoteness, 40 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but Joshua trees and scorched earth. The perfect place for a man who valued privacy above all else. The basement door swung open with a prolonged creak, revealing a staircase that disappeared into absolute darkness. The smell hit him immediately, a sweet, cloying odor that seemed to coat the back of his throat. Not decay exactly, but something chemically preserved, artificial. Rex bolted past him down the stairs, barking frantically. Marcus fumbled for the light switch, his tattooed fingers trembling slightly. The fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, casting harsh shadows across a scene that would be burned into his memory forever. The basement was larger than the cabin above, carved deep into the desert floor. Metal shelving lined the walls, filled with glass jars containing things that made Marcus's stomach lurch. At the center of the room sat a stainless steel table, its surface scarred and stained despite obvious attempts at cleaning. But it was the photographs that truly broke him. Hundreds of them, pinned to a corkboard that covered an entire wall. Hikers, campers, drifters, people who had vanished into the desert over the years. Marcus recognized some faces from missing person flyers he'd seen in truck stops and gas stations during his travels. Each photo was marked with dates, locations, and notes written in his father's meticulous handwriting. Rex whimpered at his feet, pressing close against his legs for comfort. The dog's earlier aggression had transformed into pure terror, and Marcus couldn't blame him. The basement was a monument to methodical evil, a catalogue of lives stolen and secrets buried. A manila folder lay open on the steel table, as if his father had been reviewing it before his death. Marcus approached it with the same caution he'd use when disarming a bomb. Inside were detailed maps of the surrounding desert, marked with GPS coordinates and cryptic symbols. Burial sites, he realized with growing horror. A treasure map for a different kind of treasure entirely. At the bottom of the folder, a handwritten note in his father's spidery script for Marcus. "The family business needs an heir. The desert remembers everything and forgives nothing. Continue the work." Marcus dropped the folder, backing away from the table as if it had burst into flames. 20 years of enforcing for the angels, 20 years of violence and moral compromise, and yet nothing had prepared him for this moment. His father hadn't been a hermit. He'd been a predator, using the vast emptiness of the Mojave as his personal hunting ground. The sound of an engine outside cut through his shock like a blade. Marcus froze, listening to the distinct rumble of multiple motorcycles approaching the cabin. Rex's ears perked up, a low growl building in his throat. Someone was coming, and they weren't expected to find anyone home. The cabin looked smaller than Jake remembered, squatting like a cancerous growth against the bleached landscape. 20 years had not been kind to the structure. Paint peeled from its weathered siding like diseased skin, and the front porch sagged under the weight of neglect. His Harley's engine ticked as it cooled, the only sound besides the desert wind whistling through gaps in the boards. Diesel whimpered from where he sat beside the bike, yellow eyes fixed on the cabin's dark windows. The dog's hackles remained raised, every muscle coiled tight as a loaded spring. "Easy, boy." Jake's voice cracked like old leather. He hadn't spoken to another soul in the 3 days since leaving Phoenix, and the words felt foreign on his tongue. The key was where his father had always kept it, under the ceramic frog by the steps, its hiding place as predictable as the old man's morning bourbon ritual. Jake's fingers closed around the cold metal, and for a moment he was 12 again, sneaking back after a night spent sleeping under the stars, rather than listening to his parents tear each other apart with words sharp enough to draw blood. The door swung open with a prolonged creak that seemed to echo across the empty desert. Stale air rushed out to greet him, carrying scents that transported him instantly back to childhood, cigarette smoke, motor oil, and something else, something sweet and cloying that made his stomach clench. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that sliced through gaps in the curtains. The living room remained frozen in time, as if his father had simply stepped outside for a moment rather than dying alone in a Tucson hospital bed 3 weeks ago. Empty beer bottles stood sentinel on every surface, and yellowed newspapers from 1987 still lay scattered across the coffee table. Jake set his duffel bag down and tried to ignore the way Diesel refused to cross the threshold. The dog had followed him through drug raids and bar fights, had never shown fear of anything with a heartbeat. Yet now he cowered outside like a kicked puppy. "Suit yourself," Jake muttered, but unease crawled up his spine like a living thing. The kitchen was a testament to his father's deterioration in his final years. Dishes crusted with food that had long since evolved into science experiments filled the sink. The refrigerator door hung open, its interior a cave of spoiled mysteries that explained at least part of the overwhelming stench. But there was something else beneath the obvious decay. Something that reminded Jake of the time he'd found a dead coyote behind the garage as a kid. That sweet, sick smell of things returning to the earth in ways nature never intended. A photograph on the mantel caught his eye, and his breath hitched. 3 people smiled back at him from behind cracked glass. His father, younger and lean with hope. His mother, beautiful in that desperate way of women who loved dangerous men, and between them a gap where another photo had once stood. Jake knew that empty space had once held his own 6-year-old face, back before everything went to hell. The floorboards groaned under his boots as he explored further, each step releasing decades of trapped memories. His old bedroom had been converted into storage, boxes stacked floor to ceiling like cardboard, monuments to a life lived without purpose. The master bedroom door stood ajar, revealing rumpled sheets and more beer bottles. But it was the basement door that made him pause. The heavy wooden barrier was newer than the rest of the house, its surface unmarked by time or wear. 3 deadbolt locks ran down its length, an absurd level of security for a desert cabin miles from the nearest neighbor. Jake couldn't remember his father ever being particularly concerned with home security. Hell, they'd rarely even locked the front door. Outside, Diesel began to howl. The sound raised every hair on Jake's neck, a primal keen of distress that seemed to vibrate in his bones. In all their years together, he'd never heard the dog make such a sound. It was the kind of howl that came from witnessing something that violated the natural order. Jake's hand moved instinctively to the knife on his belt as he approached the basement door. The metal locks were bright silver against the dark wood, recently installed judging by the fresh scratches around the screw holes. What had his father been trying to keep locked away down there? The first lock turned easily, then the second. Jake's palms were slick with sweat despite the desert heat. 20 years of hard living with the angels had taught him to trust his instincts, and every survival instinct he possessed was screaming at him to turn around, get on his bike, and ride until the desert swallowed this place whole. But he was Roy Mackenzie's son, and Mackenzies didn't run from anything, not rival gangs, not federal raids, and not whatever waited in the darkness below. The third lock clicked open, and Jake pulled the door wide. A smell rose from the depths that made the spoiled food upstairs seem like perfume by comparison. The dog wouldn't shut up. Marcus had tried everything, commands, threats, even tossing a beer bottle in Diesel's general direction. Nothing worked. The German Shepherd mix continued his restless pacing around the cabin's perimeter, hackles raised, letting out those low, guttural whines that made Marcus's skin crawl. "The hell's wrong with you?" he muttered, crushing his third cigarette under his boot heel. The sun had climbed higher, turning the desert air into a furnace, but the heat wasn't what made sweat bead along his hairline. Diesel had been acting strange since they'd arrived yesterday evening. The dog had always been his early warning system on the road, alerting him to cops, rival bikers, or tweakers looking for trouble. But this was different. This felt like fear. Marcus pulled another Budweiser from the cooler he'd dragged onto the porch and surveyed his father's property with fresh eyes. 20 years was a long time. Memory played tricks, softened edges, made things seem smaller than they actually were. But the cabin looked exactly the same. Weathered wood siding, corrugated metal roof, windows so grimy they barely let in light. Even the old Ford pickup sat in the same spot, though its tires had long since rotted away. The silence pressed against his eardrums. No traffic, no neighbors, no sounds of civilization. Just endless desert stretching in every direction, broken only by sagebrush and the occasional Joshua tree, standing like a scarecrow against the pale blue sky. His phone had no signal out here. Marcus had checked it compulsively since arriving, telling himself he didn't care about staying connected, but the isolation felt heavier than he remembered. As a kid, he'd loved the remoteness. Now it seemed ominous. Diesel's barking intensified, sharp and urgent. The dog had stopped pacing and stood rigid near the cabin's back corner, staring at something Marcus couldn't see. Jesus Christ! Marcus drained his beer and stood up, his knees protesting after the long ride. "Fine. Show me what's got your panties in a twist." He followed Diesel around to the cabin's rear, where the dog had begun digging frantically at the base of the foundation. Dirt and small rocks flew between his hind legs as his claws scraped against something solid. "Get away from there!" Marcus grabbed Diesel's collar and pulled him back. The dog resisted, whimpering and straining toward the hole he'd started. Marcus knelt down and brushed away the loose earth. His fingers encountered something smooth and white, probably just a rock or piece of old pipe. But as he cleared more dirt, the object's shape became unmistakable. Bone, definitely bone. His first thought was relief, just some dead animal. Coyote maybe, or a deer that had crawled under the cabin to die. But as he excavated more carefully, using a stick to scrape away the packed earth, he realized the bones were too large, too organized. The partial skull that emerged from the dirt was undeniably human. Marcus sat back hard, his heart hammering against his ribs. Diesel continued to whine and paw at the ground, but the sound seemed to come from very far away. Everything had gone sharp and hyper-real, the texture of the bone, yellow-white and pitted with age, the smell of disturbed earth, the way shadows fell differently now that the sun had moved. He should stop digging, should call the cops, let them handle whatever this was. But his hands moved of their own accord, clearing more dirt, revealing more of the skull, part of what looked like a rib cage. The bones were old, Really old. Probably older than the 20 years since he'd last been here. That should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Because if these remains had been here longer than 2 decades, his father had known about them. Had to have known. Marcus tried to remember the last time he'd seen the old man. The fight that had driven him away had been vicious, full of accusations and threats that couldn't be taken back. His father had called him worthless, a disappointment, predicted he'd end up dead or in prison within a year. Marcus had responded by threatening to burn the cabin down with the old bastard inside it. But even in his rage, even through all the screaming and broken furniture, he'd never suspected his father was capable of murder. Another 20 minutes of careful excavation revealed enough of the skeleton to confirm what he already knew. Adult human, probably male based on the size. No clothing remained, no obvious signs of what had killed him. Just bones, arranged in roughly anatomical position, suggesting the body had been buried intact rather than dumped piece by piece. Diesel had finally quieted, sitting guard beside the impromptu grave with an alertness that suggested this wasn't over, that there might be more to find. Marcus's mouth tasted like copper and stale beer. His hands shook as he lit another cigarette, trying to process what this meant, who this person had been, how long they'd been dead, whether his father had killed them or just disposed of the body, and, most importantly, how many more secrets were buried on this godforsaken piece of desert. The desert wind had picked up again, whistling through the gaps in the cabin's weathered boards like a low, mournful song. Jake sat on the porch steps, his hands wrapped around a lukewarm beer, watching Duke sniff around the edges of the property with an intensity that hadn't diminished since their arrival 3 hours ago. Every few minutes the dog would return to that same spot near the old tool shed, pawing at the hard-packed earth and whimpering. 20 years. 20 goddamn years since he'd last seen this place, and it looked like time had beaten the hell out of it worse than any bar fight he'd ever been in. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving bare wood bleached grey by countless desert summers. Windows were cracked and the front door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. But underneath all the decay, Jake could still see traces of the home he'd grown up in. The carved initials he'd left in the porch railing when he was 12. The dent in the siding where his old man had thrown a wrench during one of his drunken rages. His father had been dead 3 months before the lawyer finally tracked Jake down in Riverside. Heart attack, they said. Died alone in this godforsaken cabin, and nobody found him for 2 weeks until the mailman got suspicious about the overflowing box. The thought should have stirred something in Jake. Guilt, sadness, maybe even relief, but all he felt was the same cold emptiness that had settled in his chest the day he'd roared away on his first Harley, promising himself he'd never look back. Duke's barking snapped him out of his brooding. The German shepherd was back at the shed, this time digging furiously at the base of the structure. Dust and small rocks flew from beneath his claws as he worked himself into a frenzy. "What the hell's got into you, boy?" Jake pushed himself to his feet, his knees protesting after the long ride. Duke had been acting strange since they'd arrived, but this was different. This was the way the dog behaved when he'd caught a scent during those times they'd helped the club track down men who'd crossed the wrong people. Jake approached the shed slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. The structure was older than the cabin itself, built from railroad ties and corrugated metal that had rusted to the color of dried blood. His old man had always kept it locked, claiming it was full of mining equipment and chemicals too dangerous for kids to mess with. Jake had believed that story once upon a time, back when he still believed his father was capable of protecting anyone from anything. "Duke, back off." He grabbed the dog's collar and pulled him away from the corner where he'd been digging. The animal whined and strained against his grip, desperate to return to whatever had captured his attention. Jake knelt down and examined the spot Duke had been working on. The earth was definitely disturbed, though it was hard to tell if that was recent or old. Desert ground could hold secrets for decades, preserving them in the dry heat like some kind of natural time capsule. But there was something else, a smell, faint but unmistakable once he caught it. Sweet and cloying, like meat left too long in the sun. His stomach turned as recognition hit him. He'd smelled that particular cocktail of decay before, usually when the club needed to clean up after someone had made a terminal mistake. It was the smell of death, old and patient and final. Jake's hands were shaking as he walked around to the front of the shed. The padlock was still there, rusty but solid, just as he remembered from his childhood, but now the sight of it filled him with a dread that had nothing to do with childhood disappointment over being kept out of his father's workspace. Now it looked like what it probably had always been, a barrier meant to keep secrets in, not danger out. He retrieved a crowbar from his motorcycle's saddlebags and returned to the shed. Duke had resumed his digging, but with less frantic energy now, as if he knew his job was nearly done. The metal hasp gave way with a screech of protesting metal, and the heavy wooden door swung open on hinges that groaned like old bones. The interior was dark, lit only by the dying sunlight filtering through rust holes in the roof. Jake pulled out his phone and activated the flashlight, sweeping it across the cramped space. Old mining equipment, just as his father had always claimed. Pickaxes, shovels, coils of rope, everything covered in decades of dust and spider webs. But Duke wasn't interested in the equipment. He'd pushed past Jake and was focused on a section of the floor near the back corner where the wooden planks looked newer than the rest, different, deliberately placed. Jake's mouth went dry as he realized what he was looking at. The smell was stronger now, rising from the gaps between the boards like an accusation that had been waiting 20 years to be heard. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Marcus kept the mug clutched in his hands like an anchor. Outside, the desert wind howled against the cabin's weathered walls, a sound that had once lulled him to sleep as a child, but now felt like the earth itself was screaming. Every gust seemed to carry whispers from the pit behind the shed, voices of the dead demanding justice he wasn't sure he could deliver. Diesel lay sprawled across the threshold between the kitchen and living room, his massive head resting on his paws, but his eyes alert, tracking every movement. The dog hadn't relaxed since they'd covered the gravesite with the tarp, as if he understood the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. Marcus stared at the manila folders scattered across the kitchen table. His father's meticulous records painted a picture so grotesque it defied comprehension. Names, dates, locations, all written in Harold's precise handwriting, documenting 2 decades of methodical killing. The earliest entry dated back to 1987, just 3 years after Marcus had fled this godforsaken place. Sarah Chen, 19, runaway from Phoenix, last seen at truck stop on Route 93. The clinical notation made Marcus's stomach churn. Sarah had been someone's daughter, someone's hope. Now she was nothing but coordinates scrawled in a dead man's journal, her remains scattered in a pit that had become his father's personal cemetery. He flipped through more pages, each entry a life reduced to vital statistics. Drifters, hitchhikers, prostitutes. People society had already forgotten, making them perfect victims for a predator who understood that some disappearances never generate headlines. Harold had been careful, patient, selecting prey that wouldn't be missed until it was far too late. The sound of gravel crunching outside made Marcus freeze. Diesel's ears shot up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Marcus crept to the window and peered through the gap in the curtains. A white pickup truck sat in the driveway, its engine ticking as it cooled. Sheriff's Department insignia gleamed on the door panel. "Shit," Marcus muttered, quickly gathering the folders. He shoved them into the cupboard above the refrigerator, his heart hammering against his ribs. Heavy boots approached the front door, deliberate and unhurried. 3 sharp knocks echoed through the cabin. "Sheriff's Department." "Anyone home?" Marcus wiped his palms on his jeans and opened the door. The man standing on the porch was tall and lean, with silver hair beneath a worn Stetson and eyes the color of winter sky. His uniform was pressed and clean despite the dust that coated everything else in this forsaken landscape. "Sheriff Kowalski," the man said, extending a weathered hand. "You must be Harold's boy. Marcus, right? Heard you were back in town. News travels fast out here." Marcus shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and calloused palms. This wasn't some desk jockey playing cowboy. Small community. People notice when bikes like yours roll through. Kowalski's gaze drifted to the Harley parked beside the cabin. Sorry for your loss. Your father was a respected man around these parts. The irony of those words made Marcus's jaw clench. Appreciated. What can I do for you, Sheriff? Mind if I come in? Got a few questions about Harold's final days. Routine stuff for the county records. Every instinct Marcus had developed during 20 years of dodging law enforcement screamed at him to refuse, but turning away a sheriff asking polite questions would only generate suspicion. He stepped aside, gesturing Kowalski into the cabin. The sheriff's eyes swept the interior with professional interest, cataloging details. Place looks just like I remember. Harold never was one for change. He paused near the kitchen table, his gaze lingering on the coffee-stained surface where the damning folders had been spread moments earlier. You cleaning house? Going through his things, trying to figure out what to keep, what to donate. Marcus forced his voice to remain steady. Turns out the old man was quite the pack rat. That he was. Found him collapsed right there in the kitchen, you know. Kowalski pointed to a spot near the stove. Doc said it was quick, massive coronary, probably didn't suffer. Unlike his victims, Marcus thought bitterly. That's something, I guess. Diesel had positioned himself between the two men, his bulk radiating tension. The sheriff noticed the dog's posture, one eyebrow rising slightly. Protective, isn't he? Smart animals, dogs, they pick up on things we miss sometimes. Kowalski's tone was casual, but his eyes remained sharp. Harold mention any troubles lately? Anyone bothering him, making threats? We weren't exactly close. Hadn't spoken in years before he died. The half-truth came easily, honed by decades of telling cops exactly what they needed to hear and nothing more. Shame about that. Family's important. The sheriff moved toward the door, then paused. You planning on staying long? Haven't decided yet. Kowalski nodded slowly, his hand resting on the doorframe. Well, if you need anything, don't hesitate to call. And Marcus, be careful out here. Desert's got a way of keeping secrets, but sometimes those secrets have a way of surfacing when you least expect it. Jake's hands shook as he stared at the photographs scattered across the dusty floorboards. Each image told a story he'd never wanted to know, faces frozen in terror that would haunt him long after he left this godforsaken place. The oldest photos were yellowed with age, their edges cracked and brittle. The newest looked like they could have been taken yesterday. Ranger whined from the doorway, refusing to enter the hidden room. The dog's instincts were better than his own. He should have turned around and walked away the moment he'd found that loose board, but now he was here, surrounded by evidence of his father's true nature, and there was no unknowing what he'd learned. His father hadn't just been a violent drunk. He'd been something far worse. Jake counted 23 photographs before his stomach lurched and he had to look away. 23 victims, maybe more. Men, women, some barely out of their teens, all with that same look of absolute terror in their eyes, that moment when they realized what was happening to them. Below the photos, wrapped in oiled cloth, he found a leather journal bound with a rubber band. His father's handwriting filled page after page in meticulous detail. Dates, locations, methods, the clinical precision of it made Jake's skin crawl. This wasn't the work of someone who'd lost control in a moment of rage. This was calculated, planned, savored. The first entry was dated 32 years ago. Jake would have been 8 years old, still believing his father was just a man who drank too much and had a temper. The last entry was from 6 months ago, just weeks before the old man's heart attack. Jesus Christ, Jake whispered, his voice echoing in the small space. How many people knew? He thought about the way people in town had looked at him when he was a kid, not just with the usual suspicion reserved for the Torino family, but with something deeper, fear. They hadn't been afraid of his father's drinking or his violent outbursts. They'd been afraid of this, and they'd never said a word. Jake flipped through more pages, each entry making him sicker than the last. His father had been careful, strategic. He'd targeted drifters mostly, people who wouldn't be missed right away. Hitchhikers, runaways, the occasional tourist who'd taken a wrong turn in the desert. Sometimes he'd driven hundreds of miles to find his victims, careful never to establish a pattern close to home. But not always. Jake's blood ran cold as he read an entry from 15 years ago. A local girl named Sarah Martinez had gone missing while walking home from her job at the diner. Jake remembered the search parties, the way the whole town had come together to look for her. They'd found her car abandoned on the highway 20 miles out of town, but never found her body. According to his father's journal, they'd been looking in the wrong place. The detailed description of what had happened to Sarah made Jake's vision blur with rage and disgust. He'd known her. She'd been a year behind him in school, always quick with a smile and a kind word. While her family had spent years hoping she might still be alive somewhere, his father had been living with the knowledge of what he'd done to her. Jake slammed the journal shut and scrambled backward out of the hidden space. His chest felt tight, like he couldn't get enough air. He stumbled through the cabin and out onto the porch, where he doubled over and vomited into the sand until there was nothing left. Ranger padded over and pressed against his leg, offering what comfort a dog could give. Jake buried his face in the animal's fur and tried to think, what was he supposed to do with this information? Call the police, turn over the evidence, and watch his family name get dragged through hell? But what about the families? Sarah's parents were still alive, still wondering what had happened to their daughter. How many other families were out there, tormented by not knowing? He thought about the conversation he'd had with Rita Martinez just yesterday. Sarah's mother still worked at the post office, and she'd asked him how he was holding up after his father's death. She'd been kind to him, the way she'd always been kind to everyone. How could he look her in the eye knowing what he knew now? Jake pulled out his phone and stared at it. One call would change everything. Once he made that call, there would be no going back, no pretending he'd never found this room. The Torino name would be synonymous with horror instead of just general disrepute. But the alternative was living with this knowledge, carrying his father's secrets like stones in his chest. Ranger barked once, sharp and urgent. Jake looked up to see a dust cloud approaching on the road. Someone was coming to the cabin. His time for deciding was up. The basement stretched deeper than Jake had expected, carved directly into the desert rock beneath the cabin. His flashlight beams swept across rough-hewn walls that seemed to absorb the light, creating pockets of impenetrable shadow. The smell hit him in waves now. Death, yes, but something else. Something chemical and acrid that made his throat burn. Bones whined from somewhere behind him, refusing to follow down the narrow wooden steps. Smart dog. Jake's boots echoed against stone as he descended, each footfall announcing his presence to whatever horrors waited below. The first thing he noticed was the workbench. It ran along the far wall, meticulously organized with tools that belonged in a surgeon's kit rather than a desert hermit's workshop. Bone saws, scalpels, a collection of knives arranged by size, their edges gleaming despite years of use. Above the bench, photographs were tacked to a corkboard, dozens of them, all showing the same subject from different angles. Jake's stomach lurched as understanding crashed over him. The photographs weren't random. They were documentation, clinical, methodical. His father hadn't been a hermit hiding from the world. He'd been something far worse. The beam of his flashlight trembled as he moved it across the room, revealing more horrors with each pass. Metal tables with restraint points, drainage systems built into the floor, a camera mounted on a tripod, positioned to capture everything that happened in the center of the room. But it was the filing cabinet that made Jake's blood run cold. 4 drawers, each labeled with dates spanning decades. The top drawer bore a range that made his knees weak, 1985 to 1990. The year he'd left home was 1987. He'd been 19, full of rage and rebellion, eager to escape his father's iron fist and find his place with the angels. But now he wondered what else he'd been escaping from. With hands that shook despite 20 years of facing down rival bikers and federal agents, Jake pulled open the top drawer. Manila folders, dozens of them, each tab marked with a name and date. Sarah Chen, March 1985. Michael Torres, August 1985. Lisa Brennan, December 1985. The names meant nothing to him, but the photographs inside the folders told a story that made him wish he'd never come home, before and after shots. Progress reports written in his father's careful handwriting, notes about technique, about timing, about the subject's responses to various stimuli. Jake slammed the drawer shut and stumbled backward, his flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls. 20 years he'd carried guilt about abandoning his father. 20 years of wondering if things could have been different between them. Now he understood why his father had been so eager to see him leave. A sound from upstairs made him freeze, the distant rumble of an engine approaching the cabin. Jake killed his flashlight and moved toward the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the floorboards above, he could hear Bones barking frantically. The engine cut off. A car door slammed. Footsteps crossed the porch. Jake climbed the stairs 2 at a time, emerging into the kitchen just as someone knocked on the front door. 3 sharp raps, authoritative and impatient. He grabbed his pistol from where he'd left it on the counter and moved toward the window. A sheriff's deputy stood on the porch, young and lean, with the kind of mustache that suggested he was trying too hard to look older than his years. The patrol car behind him bore the insignia of the county sheriff's department. Jake cursed under his breath. The last thing he needed was law enforcement sniffing around, especially with what he'd just discovered in the basement. "Hello? Anyone home?" the deputy called out. "This is Deputy Martinez with the county sheriff. I'd like to ask you a few questions." Jake weighed his options. He could try to slip out the back, but the deputy would have seen his motorcycle parked beside the cabin. Running would only raise suspicions. Better to play it straight, at least for now. He tucked the pistol into his waistband and opened the door. "Deputy." Jake kept his voice level, drawing on years of practice dealing with cops who'd love nothing more than to nail a Hells Angels member on any charge they could manufacture. "You must be Thomas Reeves' son." Martinez looked him up and down, taking in the leather vest, the tattoos, the general aura of trouble that clung to Jake like smoke. "I'm sorry for your loss. I know you two weren't close, but still. What can I do for you, deputy?" "Well, there's been some concern about your father's property. Neighbors reported some unusual activity over the years. Sounds, smells, nothing concrete, mind you, but enough to warrant a welfare check now and then." Martinez shifted his weight, hand resting casually on his service weapon. "Since you're here settling his affairs, I thought it might be worth having a conversation." Jake forced himself to remain calm, even as his mind raced through possibilities. How much did this deputy know? How long had the authorities been watching his father? And most importantly, how many people were buried somewhere on this property? The photos scattered across the floor like fallen leaves, each one a window into hell. Marcus knelt among them, his hands shaking as he forced himself to look at what his father had documented. Children's faces stared back at him, some defiant, others hollow with resignation, all of them bearing the unmistakable mark of terror. Rex whined from the doorway, refusing to enter the room. The dog's instincts were sharper than Marcus had given him credit for. This place reeked of something worse than death. It stank of innocence destroyed. Marcus picked up a photograph with trembling fingers. A boy, maybe 8 years old, bound and gagged in what looked like the cabin's basement. The same basement where Marcus had hidden as a child when his father's friends came to visit. The same basement where he'd been told never to venture after dark. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. All those nights he'd heard muffled crying through the floorboards, sounds his father had dismissed as desert animals or the wind playing tricks. The locked door that had always been off limits. The way his father's associates would arrive at strange hours, their vehicles rumbling through the desert darkness. Marcus had been living above a nightmare, and somehow his 8-year-old mind had protected him from understanding the truth. He forced himself to examine more of the evidence. There were notebooks filled with dates, times, and coded references. Names that meant nothing to him now, but had probably meant everything to desperate families searching for missing children. His father hadn't just been a participant. He'd been the architect, the organizer, the monster who turned the desert cabin into a way station for the unspeakable. A manila envelope caught his attention, thicker than the others. Inside, he found what looked like financial records, payments in and out, coded transactions that painted a picture of an operation spanning decades. The amounts made his stomach turn. Children reduced to commodity prices, innocents bought and sold like livestock. But it was the final item that broke something fundamental inside him. A small spiral notebook, worn from handling, filled with his father's careful handwriting. It wasn't financial records or coded references. It was a diary of sorts, clinical observations mixed with grotesque personal reflections. The boy from Phoenix shows promise. Reminded me of Marcus at that age. Same defiant streak that needs breaking. The words blurred as rage and nausea warred in Marcus's gut. His father had compared him to the victims, had seen something in Marcus that connected to this horror. The notebook contained dozens of such entries, casual observations about children's suffering written in the same hand that had signed Marcus's childhood birthday cards. He read further, each page revealing new depths of depravity. His father had documented everything, which children fought back, which ones broke quickly, which ones never broke at all. It was a manual for destroying human souls, written by someone who found the process fascinating rather than horrific. A sound from outside made Marcus freeze. Rex's low growl carried through the cabin, followed by the distant rumble of an engine. Someone was coming up the desert road. Marcus quickly gathered the photographs and documents, his hands moving with the efficient calm of someone accustomed to crisis. 20 years of outlaw life had taught him to think clearly under pressure, even when that pressure involved discovering his father was a monster who made Marcus's own crimes look like petty theft. The engine sound grew louder, multiple vehicles moving fast, either law enforcement following leads or someone else who knew about this place and its secrets. Neither option was good for Marcus's immediate survival. He stuffed the most damning evidence into a leather satchel he found in the closet. The photos, the notebook, enough financial records to paint the full picture. The rest he left scattered. Let whoever was coming see what kind of man Thomas Kane had really been. Rex appeared at his side as Marcus slung the satchel across his shoulder. The dog's ears were flat against his head, but his tail wagged once when Marcus scratched behind them. At least one member of his family wasn't a complete monster. The vehicles were close now, close enough that Marcus could distinguish the sound of at least 2 engines, maybe 3. He moved to the window and caught sight of dust clouds rising in the distance. 5 minutes, maybe less. He thought about running, about grabbing Rex and disappearing into the desert on his Harley. But running meant leaving all of this to be buried again. It meant other children might suffer because he chose self-preservation over justice. For the first time in 20 years, Marcus Kane found himself on the right side of a moral choice. The irony wasn't lost on him. It had taken discovering the worst evil imaginable to finally show him what good might look like. He checked his pistol, made sure the satchel was secure, and prepared to face whatever was coming up that desert road. Some secrets were too dark to keep buried, even when exposing them might destroy everything he had left. The rope scratched against Jake's palms as he lowered himself into the mine shaft, the beam of his flashlight carving through decades of accumulated darkness. The walls pressed close, rough-hewn rock that seemed to breathe with the weight of the mountain above. Diesel's whimpering echoed from somewhere far below, a sound that made Jake's chest tighten with each passing second. 20 feet down, the shaft opened into a wider chamber. Jake's boots hit solid ground with a hollow thud that reverberated through the space like a gunshot. The air was thick and stale, carrying scents that made his stomach lurch. Earth and rust and something else, something organic that had been trapped down here for far too long. "Easy, boy," Jake called softly, sweeping his light across the cavern. The beam caught Diesel huddled against the far wall, his fur matted with dirt, eyes reflecting the light like twin coins. The dog was trembling but appeared uninjured. Jake took a step toward him and froze. His flashlight had illuminated something else. Metal glinting in the darkness. A chain, thick and industrial, bolted into the rock wall. His hand trembling, Jake followed the chain with his beam until the light fell upon a metal collar, corroded with age and stained with substances he didn't want to identify. But it was what lay scattered around the collar that drove the air from his lungs. Bones, small ones, child-sized. The flashlight slipped from his numb fingers, clattering against the stone floor. In the dancing shadows as it rolled, Jake caught glimpses of more evidence. Tattered fabric, a small sneaker, its bright colors long faded. Things that had no business being in this forgotten hole in the earth. Jake's knees buckled. He pressed his back against the cold stone wall, fighting the nausea that rolled through him in waves. 20 years of running from this place, 20 years of avoiding his father's calls, 20 years of telling himself he was better off not knowing, and now this. The truth he'd never wanted to face, displayed in a tomb his own father had built. Memories crashed over him like a physical blow. His father's unexplained absences when Jake was young, the locked shed behind the cabin that Jake was never allowed to enter, the way the old man's eyes would go cold and distant sometimes, as if he was seeing something far away, the children who went missing from nearby towns, stories that made headlines for weeks before fading into the background noise of a world full of horrors. Jake had always known something was wrong. Some part of him had sensed the darkness that lived beneath his father's gruff exterior. It was why he'd left, why he'd never looked back, why he'd chosen the brotherhood of the angels over the poison of blood family. But knowing and seeing were different animals entirely. Diesel whimpered again, and Jake forced himself to move. He retrieved his flashlight and approached the dog slowly, careful not to look too closely at what else might be hidden in the shadows. There would be time for that later. Time for police and investigators and all the machinery of justice that would tear through this place like a hurricane. "Come here, boy," Jake whispered, crouching down. Diesel crawled toward him on his belly, pressing against Jake's chest as if trying to burrow inside his jacket. I know you didn't want to find this either." Jake scooped up the dog and stood, his legs unsteady. The walls seemed to pulse around him, the weight of the secret pressing down like the mountain itself. How many children had his father brought to this place? How many families had never learned what happened to their sons and daughters? As he prepared to climb back to the surface, Jake's light caught something else. A notebook, wrapped in plastic and wedged into a crevice in the wall. His father's insurance policy, maybe. Or his confession. Jake grabbed it without thinking, stuffing it into his jacket pocket. Whatever it contained, whatever horrors it documented, he would face them above ground, under the clean light of the desert sun. The climb out felt endless. Each hand-over-hand pull on the rope was an effort that left him gasping. Diesel clung to him, adding weight but also providing an anchor to the present moment, a reminder that some living things could still be saved. When they finally emerged into daylight, Jake collapsed beside the shaft opening, sucking in lungfuls of clean air. The desert stretched endlessly around them, beautiful and indifferent. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled on thermal currents, hunting for prey that would never see death coming. Jake pulled out his phone with shaking hands. No signal, as expected. He would have to ride back toward town, find a place where the modern world's web of communication could reach him. Then would come the phone calls that would change everything. Police, FBI, reporters who would descend on this place like vultures. The notebook felt heavy in his pocket, a weight that had nothing to do with its physical mass. The desert wind carried the acrid smell of gasoline as Jake doused the last corner of the basement with fuel. His hands shook despite his attempts to stay steady, the weight of what he'd discovered pressing down on him like a physical force. 23 skulls, 23 lives stolen and hidden beneath his childhood home. Duke whined from his position near the stairs, sensing the tension radiating from his master. The dog had been the one to find it all, scratching and clawing at that loose floorboard until Jake had finally investigated. Now Jake wished he'd never looked, never seen the carefully arranged bone fragments his father had collected like twisted trophies. "Should have listened when Mom tried to leave," he muttered, striking a match. The flame danced in the dim light filtering down from above. Should have gone with her instead of staying loyal to that monster. The memory of his mother's final attempt to take him away burned as bright as the match in his fingers. He'd been 16, angry, convinced his father was the wronged party in their crumbling marriage. When she'd begged him to come with her to California, he'd refused, choosing to stay with the man who'd taught him to ride, to fight, to be strong. How wrong he'd been. The match burned down to his fingertips before he dropped it. The gasoline caught instantly, blue flames racing across the concrete floor in hungry rivers. The fire would destroy the evidence, but it couldn't erase what he now knew about his bloodline. Jake climbed the basement stairs 2 at a time, Duke racing ahead of him. In the kitchen, he grabbed his father's journal from the table, the leather-bound book where the old man had documented every kill with clinical precision. Names, dates, methods. Accountants approached a murder. The house groaned around him as the flames spread below. Smoke began seeping through the floorboards, and Jake knew he had minutes before the whole structure became an inferno. He stuffed the journal into his jacket and headed for the door, then stopped. On the mantelpiece sat a framed photo he hadn't noticed before. His father in a deputy's uniform, arms slung around the shoulders of another officer. Both men were smiling, but Jake's blood turned to ice when he recognized the second face. Sheriff Morrison, the man who'd been so helpful when Jake arrived in town, so understanding about family troubles, the same man who'd probably helped cover up 2 decades of disappearances. Jesus Christ, Jake breathed, snatching the photo. No wonder bodies had never been found, families never gotten closure. The law itself had been compromised, corrupted by whatever sick partnership his father had forged with Morrison. Duke barked sharply from outside, and Jake heard the rumble of an engine approaching. Through the window, he saw headlights cutting through the desert darkness. Too early to be random travelers. Someone was coming with purpose. Jake killed the interior lights and peered through the curtains. A sheriff's department cruiser rolled to a stop beside his Harley, and Morrison climbed out, hand resting on his sidearm. Behind him came a second vehicle, an unmarked sedan that disgorged 2 men Jake didn't recognize, but whose bearing screamed law enforcement. They'd come to clean up loose ends, just like they'd probably cleaned up after his father for years. The basement fire was spreading faster now, orange light dancing beneath his feet. Soon the whole cabin would be ablaze, destroying the evidence of his father's crimes, but also eliminating Jake as the only witness to the truth. Morrison approached the front door while the other men circled around back. They moved with practiced efficiency, like a team that had done this before. Jake wondered how many others had stumbled onto the truth over the years, how many had simply vanished into the desert like his father's other victims. He wasn't going to be another name in that journal. Jake slipped out the side window, rolling silently into the gravel as Duke waited in the shadows. The flames below cast flickering shadows through the house, and smoke was beginning to pour from the windows. Morrison would assume Jake was trapped inside, burning with the evidence. Let him think that. Crouched low, Jake made his way toward his motorcycle, the journal pressed against his ribs like a promise of justice. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, offering 100 escape routes for someone who knew how to navigate by the stars. Behind him, Morrison kicked in the front door just as the kitchen floor collapsed in a roar of flames and splintering wood. The sheriff's shouts mixed with the crackling inferno as Jake kick-started the Harley and gunned it into the darkness, Duke running alongside. The journal contained names, dates, locations, evidence that could bring down not just his father's legacy, but the corruption that had enabled it. Jake had spent 20 years running from his past, but now he was riding straight toward a reckoning that would shake this desert community to its core. Some secrets were too dangerous to stay buried. Morrison and his friends were about to learn that the hard way. The sheriff's department arrived in a cloud of dust and diesel fumes, 3 vehicles cutting through the desert heat like mechanical vultures. Jake watched from the cabin's front window as Deputy Martinez stepped out of the lead cruiser, her hand resting casually on her service weapon. Behind her, 2 more deputies emerged, flanking wide as if they expected trouble. Rex growled low in his throat, the sound vibrating through the floorboards. The dog had been on edge since they'd sealed the basement, pacing the cabin like a caged animal. Jake understood the feeling. "Stay calm, boy," Jake murmured, though his own nerves were stretched taut. The phone call to 911 had been the hardest thing he'd ever done, each word feeling like a betrayal of blood, however poisoned that blood might be. Martinez's knock was authoritative, but not aggressive. "Mr. Morrison? This is Deputy Martinez. We received your call." Jake opened the door, taking in the woman's sharp eyes and skeptical expression. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with a kind of steady demeanor that suggested she'd seen enough to know when someone was holding back. "Deputies." Jake nodded, stepping aside. "Thank you for coming. You reported finding human remains on the property?" Martinez's voice carried that careful neutrality cops used when they weren't sure if they were talking to a victim or a perpetrator. "In the basement. My father's been dead 6 months. I came back to settle his affairs." The rehearsed explanation felt like sawdust in his mouth. Martinez studied his face, taking in the leather vest, the tattoos, the hard lines that 20 years of riding with the angels had etched into his features. Jake could see her making calculations, fitting him into whatever mental file she kept for potential troublemakers. "Mind if we take a look?" Jake led them through the cabin, Rex padding alongside with watchful eyes. The basement door stood open, the smell already beginning to seep upward, despite their efforts to contain it. Martinez went down first, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The silence stretched long enough that Jake began to sweat. When Martinez finally emerged, her expression had shifted from skepticism to grim professionalism. "We're going to need the coroner," she told one of the other deputies, "and crime scene techs, full workup." The next deputy who went down came back up quickly, his face pale. "Jesus Christ, how many?" "At least 3 that I could see clearly," Martinez replied. "Maybe more." Her radio crackled as she called for additional personnel, the static punctuating her terse requests. Jake found himself relegated to the kitchen table, a deputy standing nearby while Martinez questioned him. The familiar weight of interrogation settled over him like an old coat, bringing back memories of other times, other rooms, other cops asking questions he couldn't fully answer. "When did you last see your father alive?" 20 years ago. "We weren't close. Any idea how long those remains have been down there?" "None." The lie came easily, though Jake's conscience twisted. But what was he supposed to say? That he'd suspected his father of horrors even then, that he'd run from this place carrying nightmares he'd tried to drown in whiskey and violence? "You live in Nevada now?" "Henderson. I've got a legitimate job, if that's what you're asking." Another half-truth. The garage work was real enough, but his other activities operated in grayer areas. Martinez leaned back in her chair. "I'm not asking about anything except what you found here, but I will say this. You called it in, which shows good faith. That counts for something." More vehicles arrived as the afternoon wore on. The coroner's van, crime scene techs with their cameras and evidence bags, a supervisor with enough brass on his uniform to suggest this was being taken seriously. The quiet desert property became a hive of official activity. Jake watched from the porch as they brought up the first body bag, then the second. Rex whined and pressed against his leg, seeking comfort or offering it. Jake wasn't sure which. "Mr. Morrison?" Martinez had emerged from supervising the scene. "We're going to be here most of the night. You'll need to find somewhere else to stay. How long before I can come back?" "Hard to say. Could be days, could be weeks. This is going to be a complex investigation." She paused, studying him again. "You planning on staying in the area?" Jake nodded toward his Harley. "I'll find a motel in town." "Good. We'll need you available for follow-up questions." Martinez handed him a business card. "And Mr. Morrison? I know this can't be easy, finding something like this about your father. But you did the right thing calling us." As Jake fired up the Harley, Rex secured in the sidecar he'd rigged years ago, He wondered if Martinez would still think he'd done the right thing when she learned the whole truth, because Jake was beginning to suspect that what they'd found in the basement was only the beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor as Jake stood beside the freshly turned earth, sweat already beading on his forehead despite the early hour. Rex sat nearby, panting in the shade of a creosote bush, his dark eyes fixed on his master with an intensity that hadn't diminished since the horrifying discovery. Jake's hands trembled as he lit another cigarette, the fourth one in the past hour. The metallic taste in his mouth had nothing to do with nicotine, and everything to do with the bile that kept rising in his throat every time he thought about what lay beneath the desert sand. The bodies weren't random victims. That much was clear from the Polaroid photographs he'd found tucked inside his father's tackle box, hidden behind rusted lures and tangled fishing line. 43 pictures in total, each one documenting a different face, a different life that had ended in this godforsaken stretch of nowhere. Some looked like drifters. Others appeared to be young women who'd probably been reported missing in towns hundreds of miles away. But it was the notebook that had shattered whatever remained of Jake's already fractured world. Written in his father's careful handwriting were dates, descriptions, and methods. 25 years of systematic killing, starting just 2 years after Jake had been born. The entries read like a mechanic's log, clinical and detached, noting everything from the victims' approximate ages to the weather conditions on the nights they died. Jake had always known his father was a hard man, cruel even, but this went beyond anything his teenage imagination had conjured during those long nights when he'd plotted his escape from this place. This was the methodical documentation of a monster who'd used the isolation of the desert to feed an appetite that Jake couldn't even begin to understand. The worst part was the pattern he'd discovered in the dates. His father's killing had intensified during the months when Jake had still lived here, as if the boy's presence had somehow triggered something darker in the old man. Jake found himself calculating the timeline, wondering how many times he'd slept peacefully in his bed while someone was dying just a few hundred yards away. Rex's sudden bark snapped Jake back to the present. A dust cloud was approaching from the direction of the highway, still miles away but clearly heading toward the cabin. Jake's blood went cold as he recognized the distinctive outline of a sheriff's patrol vehicle. Moving quickly, he gathered the photographs and shoved them back into the tackle box, his mind racing through possibilities. Maybe someone had seen the smoke from his campfire. Maybe a neighbor had reported activity at the supposedly empty cabin. Or maybe, after 20 years, someone had finally connected the dots between his father's property and the long list of missing persons cases that stretched across 3 states. The patrol car was getting closer, kicking up a larger plume of dust now. Jake could make out that it was a single vehicle, which meant either one deputy on a routine check or a detective who thought he was just following up on a cold lead. Either way, Jake couldn't let them start digging around the property. He whistled for Rex and headed back toward the cabin, his mind working through the story he'd have to tell. He was just a son who'd come back to settle his father's affairs, maybe fix up the place before selling it. Nothing suspicious about that. The fresh earth could be explained as preparation for a septic system repair. The tackle box would go back where he'd found it, and he'd play the role of the grieving son who'd been too busy with his own life to stay in touch. As the patrol car turned onto the dirt road leading to the cabin, Jake forced himself to adopt a casual posture, leaning against the porch railing like a man without a care in the world. But his right hand instinctively moved to the Colt, .45 tucked under his leather jacket, a nervous habit that had kept him alive through more than a few dangerous situations over the years. The car pulled to a stop about 30 feet from the cabin, and a middle-aged deputy climbed out, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. He was alone, which was either very good news or very bad news, depending on what had brought him out here. "Morning," the deputy called out, his voice carrying easily across the still desert air. "I'm Deputy Martinez with the county sheriff's office. Mind if I ask what brings you out to this old place?" Jake stubbed out his cigarette and pushed himself away from the railing, forcing what he hoped was a natural smile onto his face. Just taking care of some family business, officer. My father passed recently, and I'm trying to decide what to do with the property." The deputy's eyes swept across the cabin, the disturbed earth, and finally settled on Jake himself. "I'm sorry for your loss. Would that be Henry Caldwell who passed?" "That's right." Jake kept his voice steady, even as his pulse quickened. The fact that the deputy knew his father's name meant this wasn't a random check. The sheriff's cruiser kicked up a plume of dust as it disappeared down the dirt road, leaving Jake alone with the weight of his decision. He watched until the taillights vanished into the desert darkness, then turned back toward the cabin. The silence felt different now, heavier, more accusatory. Even Diesel seemed subdued, staying close to his legs as they walked back inside. The living room looked like a crime scene, which Jake supposed it was now. Yellow tape would come tomorrow, along with forensics teams and detectives who would tear apart every inch of his father's life. But tonight, he had a few hours to prepare himself for what was coming. He grabbed a beer from the refrigerator and sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the phone. There were calls he needed to make, to the club, to his parole officer, to the few family members who might still care. But his hands remained motionless on the scarred wooden surface. 20 years. 20 years he'd carried the guilt of abandoning his father, of choosing the angels over family loyalty. 20 years of imagining different conversations they might have had, different endings to their story. Now he knew why his father had been so distant, so cold. Harold Reeves hadn't been disappointed in his son's choices. He'd been terrified that Jake might discover what kind of man had raised him. The irony wasn't lost on him. Jake had spent 2 decades as an outlaw, breaking laws and hurting people in ways both small and large. He'd convinced himself he was the black sheep, the family disappointment. Yet compared to what his father had done in this desert sanctuary, Jake's crime seemed almost quaint. Diesel whined softly from his position by the door. The dog hadn't been the same since leading Jake to that hellish discovery. Animals knew things, sensed wrongness in ways humans couldn't. How long had his father's victims been down there? How many families had wondered what happened to their missing daughters, their vanished wives? The questions multiplied like cancer cells, each one spawning 3 more. Had his mother known? Was that why she'd left when Jake was 12, taking nothing but the clothes on her back? Jake had always blamed his father's drinking, his violent temper. Now he wondered if she'd stumbled onto something far worse and run for her life. He pulled out his cell phone and scrolled to Tommy's number. His sergeant-at-arms would be expecting an update, some explanation for why Jake had missed tonight's church meeting. But how do you tell your brothers that your homecoming had turned into a horror show? How do you explain that the man who raised you was a monster? The phone rang twice before Tommy's gravelly voice answered. "About fucking time, Reeves. Viper's been asking questions about where you disappeared to." "I'm still at my old man's place," Jake said, his voice sounding strange in his own ears. "There's been a complication." "What kind of complication? You sound like shit." Jake closed his eyes, trying to find words that wouldn't sound insane, the kind that involves cops and federal agents. "I'm going to be tied up here for a while." Silence stretched across the line. In the Angels' world, police involvement was never good news. It usually meant someone was facing serious time or turning state's evidence. Either way, it made the entire club vulnerable. "You need help?" Tommy's voice had shifted, becoming careful and professional. "Or do you need distance?" It was a fair question. If Jake was compromised, if he'd gotten himself into something that could splash back on the club, the smart move would be to cut him loose until the situation resolved itself. Jake appreciated Tommy's directness. It reminded him that some relationships were built on honesty, even brutal honesty. "I'm not hot," Jake said finally, "but I won't be coming back to Oakland anytime soon. Personal family shit that doesn't involve the club. You sure about that?" "Dead sure." The phrase hung in the air like smoke. "Tell Viper I'll check in when I can, but I need to handle this alone." After Tommy hung up, Jake sat in the growing darkness, listening to the desert wind rattle the cabin's windows. Tomorrow would bring chaos, Reporters, investigators, neighbors who would claim they'd always known something was off about Harold Reeves. His father's name would become synonymous with evil, whispered in the same breath as other monsters who'd hidden their true nature behind ordinary facades. But tonight, Jake was still Harold's son, still the boy who'd grown up in this cabin, still the man who'd spent 20 years believing his father was just a bitter drunk with a mean streak. Tomorrow he'd have to face the world's questions and judgment. Tonight, he could grieve for the father he'd thought he had, the one who'd never really existed at all. Diesel padded over and rested his massive head on Jake's knee, offering the only comfort available in a place where comfort had become an extinct concept. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Jake's father sat hunched in the wooden chair, his weathered hands trembling as they gripped the armrests. The confession hung in the air, poisonous and undeniable. 23 years, the old man whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind rattling the cabin windows. 23 years I've carried this weight. Jake felt his world tilting on its axis. The bodies in the cellar weren't random victims. They were connected to his family in ways that made his stomach churn. His mother hadn't died in a car accident like he'd been told. She'd been murdered, along with her lover, right here on this cursed piece of desert. You killed her, Jake said, the words scraping his throat raw. You killed my mother. She was going to leave me. His father's eyes were distant, lost in memories that had festered for decades. Take you with her. Said she loved him. That worthless piece of... He stopped himself, looking up at Jake with eyes full of pain and justification. I couldn't let that happen. Couldn't let her destroy our family. Rex whimpered from his position by the door, sensing the electric tension crackling through the room. Jake's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Every instinct screamed at him to put his hands around the old man's throat, to squeeze until those rheumy eyes went dark. So you buried them under the house, Jake said. Told everyone she died in some accident in Phoenix. Made me grow up thinking she abandoned us. I protected you. His father's voice cracked like a whip. You think growing up knowing your mother was a whore would have been better, knowing she chose some nobody over her own family? Jake stepped closer, his massive frame casting a shadow over the broken man in the chair. You destroyed everything. My whole life has been built on a lie. Your life? His father laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. What about mine? You think it was easy living with what I did, watching you grow up looking more like her every day? Every time you smiled, every time you laughed, it was her face staring back at me. The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. His father hadn't just been distant and cold, he'd been haunted, seeing a dead woman's ghost in his son's features. It explained the drinking, the anger, the way he'd pushed Jake away until leaving seemed like the only option. The other bodies, Jake said. There are more than just 2 down there. His father's silence was answer enough. Jake felt something cold and terrible unfurling in his chest. How many? Jake's voice was deadly quiet. Does it matter now? How many? The old man closed his eyes. 5. Over the years, people who got too close to the truth, asked too many questions. A private investigator her family hired when she first went missing. A neighbor who saw too much that night. He opened his eyes, meeting Jake's horrified stare. I'm not proud of it, but I did what I had to do to protect us. Jake staggered backward, his mind reeling. His father wasn't just a murderer. He was a serial killer who'd been operating from this isolated cabin for over 2 decades. The Hells Angels had been his family, his brotherhood, but they were choir boys compared to the monster who'd raised him. The law's going to come eventually, his father continued, his voice taking on an urgent edge. Someone's bound to connect the dots, especially now that you're here stirring things up. We need to figure out what we're going to do. We? Jake's voice was hollow with disbelief. There is no we. You're a psychopath. I'm your father. The old man struggled to his feet, his frail body shaking with emotion. Blood is blood, Jake. Whatever I've done, whatever mistakes I've made, you're my son. That has to count for something. Jake looked at this man who'd given him life, who'd taught him to ride a bike and throw a punch, who'd also murdered innocent people, buried them like garbage beneath their home. The cognitive dissonance was tearing him apart. Outside, the wind picked up, sending tumbleweeds scratching against the cabin walls like skeletal fingers. Rex whined again, his dark eyes fixed on Jake as if sensing his master's inner turmoil. "I loved her," his father said softly. "Your mother. Loved her more than my own life. When she betrayed me, when she was going to take you away, something inside me just snapped. I never meant for it to go this far." Jake stared at him, seeing not the powerful, intimidating figure of his childhood memories, but a broken, pathetic old man who'd let jealousy and rage consume him until there was nothing left but bones and secrets. The decision forming in Jake's mind felt inevitable, like gravity pulling him toward an inescapable conclusion. The sheriff's cruiser kicked up a plume of dust as it disappeared down the dirt road, leaving Jake alone with the silence of the desert and the weight of what he'd just unleashed. He stood on the porch, watching until the taillights became pinpricks in the gathering dusk, then nothing at all. Diesel whined from inside the cabin, scratching at the door. Jake had locked him in during the sheriff's visit, not trusting what the dog might do around strangers after everything that had happened. The animal had been on edge since they'd discovered the bodies, alternating between aggressive vigilance and trembling anxiety. Jake opened the door and Diesel bounded out, immediately beginning a frantic patrol of the property's perimeter. The dog's behavior had changed fundamentally. Where once he'd been Jake's loyal shadow, content to lounge in whatever shade he could find, now he moved like a sentry, ears constantly pricked, nose working overtime. The cabin felt different too. What had once been his father's domain, heavy with the old man's presence and decades of accumulated silence, now seemed hollow, violated. The sheriff's team had been thorough but respectful, treating the property like the crime scene it had become. They'd taken photos, measurements, samples of dirt from around the burial site. They'd bagged his father's journals, his tools, anything that might provide evidence or insight into Marcus Reeves' 2-decade killing spree. Jake walked to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator, staring at the beer bottles lined up on the door. His father's beer. He grabbed one, twisted off the cap, and took a long pull. It tasted like betrayal. The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the desert quiet. Jake let it ring 4 times before answering. "Yeah? Mr. Reeves? This is Detective Martinez with the county. We met earlier with Sheriff Bronson." Jake remembered her. Mid-40s, sharp eyes, the kind of cop who noticed everything. "What do you need?" "I wanted to let you know we've gotten preliminary results from the coroner. We're looking at 7 bodies total, all showing signs of violent death. The state of decomposition suggests they were buried at different times over the past 15 to 20 years. 7 people, 7 families who'd lost someone and never knew what happened." Jake closed his eyes, seeing again his father's meticulous handwriting in those journals, the careful documentation of each victim's final moments. "We're also going to need you to come in tomorrow for a more detailed statement," Martinez continued. "I know this is difficult, but there are questions about the timeline, about when you last had contact with your father. I told the sheriff everything. I understand, but we need it on record. And frankly, Mr. Reeves, you're going to be under scrutiny here. You're his son. You inherited the property where the bodies were found, and you've been estranged from him for 20 years. People are going to ask questions about what you knew and when you knew it." Jake felt anger rising in his chest, hot and familiar. "You think I was part of this? I think you're a person of interest in a multiple homicide investigation. That's just the reality. The best thing you can do is cooperate fully and help us understand your father's state of mind, his routines, his associations." After Martinez hung up, Jake stood holding the dead phone, processing the implications. He'd thought coming forward was the end of it, but it was just the beginning. There would be investigations, media attention, legal proceedings that could drag on for years. His father's crimes would become public knowledge, and by extension, so would Jake's connection to them. He walked outside, needing air that didn't feel contaminated by the cabin's walls. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, painted purple and orange by the setting sun. Somewhere out there, his father had found his victims. Hitchhikers, maybe, or people whose cars had broken down on the remote highways. People who'd trusted a helpful stranger offering assistance. Diesel appeared at his side, pressing his massive head against Jake's leg. The dog's presence was a comfort, a reminder that not everything in his life was tainted by his father's darkness. Jake scratched behind the animal's ears, grateful for the unconditional loyalty. "We're gonna have to leave this place," he told the dog quietly. "Can't stay here anymore." But even as he said it, Jake wondered if leaving would be enough. His father's blood ran in his veins, the same DNA, the same genetic inheritance. How many times had people told him he looked just like Marcus Reeves? How many of his father's traits lay dormant inside him, waiting for the right trigger? The questions haunted him as night fell over the desert, bringing with it a chill that seemed to seep into his bones. In the distance, coyotes began their evening song, wild and lonely. Jake listened to their calls and wondered if monsters were born or made, and whether knowing the difference would matter when his own reckoning came. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Frank's weathered hands trembled as he reached for the whiskey bottle, his movements mechanical, defeated. The amber liquid sloshed against the glass as he poured, the sound unnaturally loud in the suffocating quiet of the cabin. "You want to know how it started?" Frank's voice was barely above a whisper, his eyes fixed on the amber depths of his drink. "Your mother. She was sick, Jake. Sicker than anyone knew." Jake felt his jaw clench, his fists balling at his sides. "Don't you fucking dare blame her for this." "I'm not blaming her." Frank's head snapped up, eyes blazing with a mix of pain and fury. "I'm trying to explain what broke inside me when she died. What made me into this thing you see before you." Rex whined from his position by the door, sensing the electricity in the air. His dark eyes darted between the two men, muscles coiled as if ready to bolt or fight depending on which way the wind shifted. Frank took a long pull from his glass, wincing as the whiskey burned down his throat. "After the funeral, I couldn't function. You were 13, angry, hurting. I was supposed to be your father, supposed to help you through it, but I was drowning myself. The bottle became my best friend, and you became a stranger. So you started killing people?" The words came out flat, emotionless, but Jake's insides were churning like a storm-tossed sea. "The first one was an accident." Frank's voice cracked. "Some drifter came through town, tried to break into the house while you were at school. I was drunk, paranoid, thought he was going to hurt you. I grabbed the shotgun and—" he gestured vaguely toward the basement door. "When it was over, when I saw what I'd done, I should have called the sheriff, should have faced the consequences. But you didn't." "No." I panicked. Buried him out there in the desert, told myself it was self-defense, that no one would believe me anyway. But burying him, there was something about it that felt— Frank struggled for the words. Final, peaceful, like I had control over something again. Jake's stomach lurched as understanding dawned. "You got a taste for it." Frank nodded slowly, shame etched deep in the lines of his face. The second one was a year later, another drifter. This time I told myself I was protecting the town, cleaning up the riffraff, but deep down, I knew the truth. I was chasing that feeling again, that moment of absolute power. The room seemed to be closing in around them. Jake could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, could smell the metallic tang of old blood that seemed to permeate every surface of the cabin. Outside, the desert wind picked up, rattling the windows like skeletal fingers. "How many?" Jake's voice was hoarse, barely recognizable. Frank was quiet for so long that Jake thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, the number hit like a physical blow. 17. Over the years. Always drifters, always people who wouldn't be missed. I told myself I was being careful, selective, that I was some kind of guardian. Jake's legs gave out, and he collapsed into the moth-eaten chair across from his father. 17 lives. 17 families who might have wondered what happened to their missing sons, daughters, brothers, sisters. 17 human beings reduced to bones in the desert sand. The basement, Jake managed to choke out. "What's in the basement?" Frank's face went ashen, the ones from winter, when the ground was too hard to dig. I had to store them somewhere. The implications hit Jake like a sledgehammer. All those years he'd lived in this house, played in these rooms, slept under this roof, the nightmares he'd had as a teenager, the feeling that something was watching him, the way Rex had reacted to the basement door. It all made horrible sense now. "Sick fuck!" The words came out in a whisper, but they carried the weight of 20 years of pain and confusion. All this time, I thought I was the monster. Thought I was broken because I couldn't connect with people, couldn't feel things the way I was supposed to. But it was you. It was always you. Frank's face crumpled. "Jake, please, you have to understand." "Understand what? That my father is a goddamn serial killer? That I grew up in a fucking tomb?" Jake shot to his feet, pacing like a caged animal. Jesus Christ, no wonder I turned out the way I did. No wonder I could never... He stopped mid-sentence, a new horror washing over him. The violence that had always simmered just beneath his surface, the way he'd never flinched from the brutal realities of club life, the cold detachment he'd cultivated over the years. "What did you make me into?" he whispered. The headlights of Jake's Harley cut through the pre-dawn darkness as he roared down the desert highway, his heart hammering against his ribs. Behind him, the cabin was nothing but ash and smoke, the flames having consumed every trace of his father's monstrous legacy. The evidence was gone, but the weight of what he'd discovered would follow him forever. Diesel pressed against his back in the motorcycle's cargo net, whimpering softly. The dog had saved them both by leading him to that basement room, to the horror his father had hidden beneath their home for decades. Now they were fugitives, racing toward an uncertain future with sirens wailing somewhere in the distance. Jake's phone buzzed against his thigh. He pulled over at a truck stop 20 miles from the cabin, hands shaking as he answered Detective Morrison's call. "Jake, where the hell are you?" Morrison's voice was tight with urgency. "We've got reports of a structure fire at your father's property." "The cabin's gone," Jake said, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. "Everything burned down." "Jesus Christ, are you hurt? What happened?" Jake closed his eyes, seeing again the photographs scattered across his father's desk, the makeshift morgue in the basement, the journal filled with dates and names that would haunt his dreams forever. His father hadn't just been a killer, he'd been a collector, preserving trophies from victims spanning 30 years. "My father was the desert killer," Jake said quietly. "All those missing people over the years, they're buried out here." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. When Morrison finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "How do you know?" "I found his collection room. Photos, personal items, a journal with locations." Jake's stomach churned as he remembered the wall of Polaroids, each one showing a face frozen in terror. "There are at least 20 victims, maybe more. Some of the graves are marked on a map. Where's the evidence now?" "Gone. Everything burned." Jake couldn't tell Morrison that he'd started the fire himself, that he'd made the choice to destroy rather than preserve the sick shrine his father had built. Some truths were too poisonous to survive. "We need you to come in, Jake. Help us find those burial sites." "I can't." Jake watched a semi-truck rumble past, its red taillights disappearing into the darkness. "I'm leaving. Running won't solve anything. You're not your father." "Aren't I?" The words came out bitter and raw. 20 years I stayed away because I was afraid of what I might become. Turns out I should have been afraid of what he already was. Jake ended the call and removed the battery from his phone. Morrison was a good man, but he couldn't understand the crushing weight of carrying a monster's blood. The Hells Angels had taught Jake about loyalty and brotherhood, but what loyalty did he owe to a father who'd murdered innocent people? He thought about the victims' faces in those photographs, young women mostly, but some men too. Each one somebody's daughter or son, somebody's missing piece that never came home. His father had stolen their lives and hoarded their memory like treasure. Diesel nuzzled against him, and Jake scratched the dog's ears. At least he'd saved one life from that house of horrors. The German shepherd had been traumatized by whatever he'd witnessed in that basement, but dogs were resilient. They could heal from things that broke humans beyond repair. Jake started the Harley and pulled back onto the highway, heading north toward the state line. He had maybe 6 hours before the authorities found the cabin's remains and started piecing together the truth. By then, he planned to be far away, just another ghost drifting through America's forgotten corners. In his jacket pocket, he carried the only piece of evidence he'd salvaged from the fire, a single photograph of the first victim, a teenage girl who'd disappeared when Jake was just a boy. He'd recognized her face from missing person posters that had papered the town decades ago. She'd been someone's daughter, someone's hope that never came home. The desert highway stretched endlessly ahead, bordered by scrubland and distant mountains, painted purple by the approaching dawn. Jake had spent 20 years running from his past, but now he understood that some shadows were too long to escape. His father's crimes would follow him wherever he went, a legacy of blood that could never be fully washed clean. Behind him, smoke still rose from the ruins of his childhood home. Ahead lay the uncertain promise of distance and anonymity. Jake twisted the throttle and roared into the growing light, carrying the weight of 20 victims' stories and the terrible knowledge that monsters sometimes wore the faces of fathers. The desert kept its secrets well, but some secrets were too heavy for the living to bear alone. The sirens grew louder as Jake stood in the desert wind, his father's confession still echoing in his mind. 23 victims, 23 families who never got closure. The weight of it pressed down on him like the oppressive heat that had been building all morning. Sheriff Martinez emerged from her patrol car first, hand resting on her weapon as she approached. Her eyes swept the scene, the disturbed earth, the scattered bones, the 2 men who looked like they'd been to hell and back. "Jake Murdoch," she called out. "We need to talk." Jake nodded toward his father, who sat slumped on an overturned bucket near the cabin, looking every one of his 74 years. "He's the one you want to hear from." The next few hours blurred together in a haze of crime scene tape, forensic teams, and endless questions. Jake watched from a distance as they carefully excavated the area behind the cabin, his father's detailed confession guiding their work. The old man had kept meticulous records, hidden in a floor safe that Jake never knew existed. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Dr. Sarah Chen from the medical examiner's office approached Jake. Her face was grim but not unkind. "Your friend there," she said, gesturing toward Rusty, who lay panting in the shade of Jake's Harley. "He's got good instincts. Without him, these people might never have been found." Jake scratched behind Rusty's ears. The dog had been subdued since the discovery, as if he understood the gravity of what he'd uncovered. "What happens now?" "Long process," Dr. Chen admitted. "Identification, notification of families, the investigation into how your father, how he managed this for so long without detection." She paused. "We found evidence going back to 1987, maybe earlier." Jake closed his eyes. He'd been just 16 when it started, living under the same roof, sharing meals, never knowing that the man who taught him to ride a motorcycle was taking lives in the desert night. Sheriff Martinez joined them as the forensic team began loading evidence into their vehicles. "We're going to need you to stay in town for a while," she told Jake. "There'll be more questions, probably media attention once this breaks." "I figured." Jake looked toward the cabin, where his father was being helped into the back of a patrol car. The old man caught his eye through the window, and for a moment Jake saw not a monster, but the broken human being his father had become. It didn't excuse anything, but it complicated everything. "He wants to see you," Martinez said quietly, "before we transport him." Jake walked over to the patrol car on unsteady legs. His father's hands were cuffed, but his eyes were clearer than they'd been in days. "I never wanted you to know," his father whispered. "That's why I drove you away, why I made you hate me. I thought if you stayed gone, Dad." The word felt foreign on Jake's tongue after so many years of anger. "I'm sorry, son. For all of it. For what I did, for the lies, for the years we lost." Tears tracked down the old man's weathered cheeks. "I know you can't forgive me. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that loving you and your mother, that was the only real thing in my life." Jake stepped back as the patrol car pulled away, taking his father toward a justice that was 20 years overdue. The desert fell quiet, except for the wind and the distant hum of the crime scene vehicles. Jake stood alone with Rusty, looking out at the vast emptiness that had hidden so much horror for so long. His phone buzzed. "A text from Tommy back in Oakland. Haven't heard from you, brother. Everything okay?" Jake stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "It will be." He thought about the club, about the life he'd built from anger and rebellion, about the family he'd chosen when his blood family fell apart. None of that felt real anymore. The truth had a way of reshaping everything around it. As the last of the official vehicles disappeared down the dirt road, Jake packed his few belongings and secured them to his bike. Rusty watched him with intelligent eyes, tail wagging tentatively. "What do you think, boy? Ready to see what's out there?" The dog barked once, sharp and decisive. Jake mounted his Harley and looked back at the cabin one final time. Tomorrow it would be a crime scene. Next week, probably a media circus. Eventually it would return to dust, like everything else in the desert. But tonight, it was just a place where secrets had finally been laid to rest. He kicked the engine to life, and with Rusty running alongside, rode toward the highway and whatever came next.